An added feature for this course is the addition of Larry Bothe's list of 26 points that you can get from his presentation to help you become a better instructor and pilot. Now let me introduce Larry. Larry Bothe is a retired DPE, master instructor, FAASTeam representative, and Gold SEAL flight instructor with 8,000 hours, and he's from Spencer, Indiana. Larry's also an independent flight instructor with Cherry Hill Aviation at Freeman Municipal Airport, SER. So now, with that, let's hear from Larry.
When I do flight reviews or do check rides, I see pilots just working their tails off trying to accomplish basic things with airplanes. So I want to talk about that. It seems like sometimes new pilots are being forced to pay their dues. Nobody tells them the secrets about how to fly airplanes more easily or more economically. They sort of get forced into doing things the hard way first, and I don't think that's right, and I'm going to tell you why. I think that in some cases, flight instructors know these things that make life easier, but for one reason or another, they don't teach them, and I want to encourage you to do that. And I think that all of these things impinge on the terrible pilot dropout that we have, right? Like 70% of people who start taking flying lessons don't finish them. They stop for some reason. And it can be a lot of things. It can be economic hardship, too much time, and so forth. But I think part of it is that we as flight instructors sometimes make flying the airplane harder than it is. And then students find out it's not as much fun as they thought, and they move on and do something else. So let's see. So then I want to talk about things that make flying easier, safer, and a whole lot more fun, and in some cases cheaper. So let's talk about that. First thing I'd like to talk about is how you can use trim in the airplane to make the airplane do work for you. When we get ready to take off in an airplane, we set the trim for takeoff, right? And in this photo, you can see that the trim indicator is actually positioned a little bit below the little caret arrow that tells you where Cessna would like you to set it for takeoff. That's because our flight school airplane is a 1981. The system's a little bit worn, and it just works better to set it there. What do you get out of that? If you, in the airplane that you normally teach in, if you figure out where the trim should be set for a normal climb, in a Skyhawk that's about 80 knots, set the trim there, get your student to set the trim there, then get your student to look down and see where the trim indicator is positioned. From then on, set it there for takeoff. Then after takeoff, the airplane just settles into a normal climb, and the student just doesn't have to fiddle with the trim to get a normal climb. You're doing less work, it's easier, and it's kind of like magic. You take off and it just climbs at the right attitude, at the right airspeed. So I'd like to get you to do that when you teach. Another thing you can do with trim, and actually this is the number one thing where I see people just working their tails off for nothing. And I didn't learn this until I had around 400 hours, and I decided to go get an instrument rating because I had bought an airplane. I wanted to get more utility out of it. Leveling off from climb to cruise. Normally, when we take off, and I'll say to somebody, why don't you level off at 3,000 feet? They get up to, I don't know, 2,900 or 950. They're already starting to lower the nose, and they're already starting to retard the throttle, like the world's going to come to an end if they go above 3,000 feet. And so what ends up happening is they usually don't make it to 3,000 feet. They end up in level flight, a few hundred feet under that. 30, 40, 50 feet under it. And then they leave the nose up a little bit. So the airplane doesn't accelerate well because they've already retarded the throttle. And so then they notice they're too low and the airplane's struggling. And finally they get up. Then they lower the nose. And then the RPM goes up, right? Because they've unloaded the propeller disc. Then they go, oh, I didn't mean to be turning 2,400. And they reach over here and they retard the throttle. Usually the nose drops. And in the meantime, they're trimming, right? But every time they make a change, they have to retrim. So the end result of all this is they fly through the air like a porpoise, and literally for 2 or 3 minutes until the airplane will actually fly hands off and it's at cruise speed. You can do this in 15 seconds. You don't have to spend 2 or 3 minutes. What you do is, as you approach your intended altitude, don't do anything. In fact, climb through it on purpose. Go 50 feet too high. Whatever you want. 3,000 feet, go to 3,050. Then lower the nose all the way to level flight, right? And you're going to teach your student what level flight looks like. It's one of the first things you do. So you lower the nose all the way to level flight. Now, you're still at full throttle. The airplane, because it's at full throttle, but now is being asked to fly in level flight instead of climb, has lots of excess power. So it immediately accelerates to cruise flight. As it does that now, you have to push forward on the control wheel or the stick pretty hard. So while you're holding forward on the control wheel with your left hand in a Skyhawk, you reach down to the bottom of that little trim wheel with the knobs, grab it at the bottom, roll it all the way to the top once. That takes away almost all the pressure. Just a coarse trim adjustment so you don't have to push very hard. If you're flying a Piper Warrior, reach down between the seat, roll that little wheel twice. You get the same effect. And if you're flying some other airplane, that's okay. You can soon figure out what the coarse trim adjustment ought to be, and then you can teach it. Once you do that, the airplane accelerates to cruise really fast, like I said. And often, by the time you can do the coarse trim adjustment, it's essentially at cruise already. Then just reach over, retard the throttle to whatever your chosen cruise power setting is, because you're already at cruise speed. And guess what? The RPM stays there because the propeller disc is already unloaded. When you do the power reduction, it often takes away the remainder of the forward pressure you were holding on the wheel to keep it from flying. So then all you have to do is make a minor trim adjustment to accommodate for how your airplane's loaded that day. Is there somebody in the back? Is it a light student, a heavy student? Do you have half tanks? I don't know. Just make a finely tune the trim, takes a couple seconds, and all of that I just talked about takes 10 to 15 seconds, and the airplane is in level cruise flight without hardly any work because you made the airframe do it. Paying $135 to rent an hour to rent the airplane, put it to work. And then, of course, if you're going to be in level cruise flight for any length of time, you should lean the mixture. How about descending and leveling off? If you want the airplane to descend in a comfortable rate of descent, 500, 600, 700 feet a minute, all you have to do is pull off 300 RPM, or if you're flying an airplane with a constant speed prop, pull off 3 inches. Don't touch the trim. Don't enrich in the mixture. Just change the power and let the nose seek its own position. Note, while you're on the way down, after it settles, have a look at the rate of descent. Let's say you end up with 600 feet a minute. Take 10% of that, 60 feet. Then, as you approach your desired lower altitude, when you get within 60 feet of that, smoothly but promptly bring the power back up to wherever it was before. When you bring the power up, you don't have to pull back on the control wheel to get the nose to come up. It'll come up by itself. You set the power. It uses the last 60 feet to finish leveling off and coming to level flight. And it's like it has altitude capture with an autopilot. Now, because you're at a lower altitude and you've increased the power once again, you'll need to reset the mixture so you don't do anything bad to the engine. But you don't need to set the mixture on the way down. You won't cook anything at a reduced power setting. Okay. How about trimming for best glide? God forbid the engine should quit. I do another presentation about when the engine goes silent, but that's not a presentation for another time. You need to get students to set the trim for best glide, because if they simply pitch for best glide using the control wheel or the stick, and then they move on to other things in the engine failure checklist, what ends up happening is that hand that was holding the back pressure to get the airplane to fly at best glide speed, it forgets to pull. And pretty soon, instead of going 65 knots, they're going 80 or 90, and they're going down over 1,000 feet a minute instead of the 500 or 600 feet a minute they'd like to be going down. So you have to trim. So you tell people to trim. Okay? So they roll the trim wheel a couple times, and then they test. They relax the pressure on the control wheel, nose drops. Oh, I need some more. And trim some more, test some more, trim some more. It takes a long time when they ought to be doing something else. You know what? If you just trim the airplane full nose up, just move the trim control, whatever kind of control it is, until it stops moving. And if you say, oh, no, you can't do that, it'll do a trim stall. No, it won't. It's a certification requirement, the airplane not stall, full nose up, trim power off. And you know what further? They fly at about best glide. Skyhawks with 2 people in them fly at about 63 knots. Hey, that's within 2 knots of the published best glide speed. Close enough for me. Once you set the trim, then you don't have to worry about airspeed. Airspeed takes care of itself, and you can do it really fast. Then you can get on to the rest of the things you ought to be doing, like declaring an emergency. So somebody will come get you and take you to the hospital. So anyway, this trim business is important. The only thing you have to be careful of is if you trim the full nose up, then after you've demonstrated this or practiced it, you're not really going to land. You stuff the throttle back in. Now you get a heck of a pitch up, so you have to be aware that you have to hold forward pressure on the control wheel while you reach down and adjust the trim. You can do things with the mixture and the throttle. Let's have a look at that. So when should we be leaning the mixture? I have a whole room full of CFIs. Somebody tell me when you should lean the engine. Right here, this gentleman's going to tell me right now. Okay, that's true. He says you ought to lean it as soon as you start the engine, and that's the next slide. You're getting ahead of me. Or a couple slides. You should ground lean, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I was thinking of if you're going to be cruising somewhere, when should you lean the mixture? Like at what altitude? Anyone take a shot at that? Right there. What do you think? He says 3,000 feet. Anybody else have an opinion? Sometimes I get 5,000. Here's the answer I think is right. Anytime you're in level cruise flight. And that's what both engine manufacturers say. Go stop at the Continental booth, go by the Lycoming booth, ask them when you ought to lean the engine. Anyway, anytime you're in level cruise flight is the answer. And if you read the cruise performance charts that come with the POH, you know what? Every one of them has a specific note that says, with recommended lean mixture. And you know what? The cruise performance charts go below 3,000 feet. They don't say anything about don't lean below 3,000. Engines generally run richer than necessary. And so you should be leaning at any time you're in level cruise flight. and you should teach it that way. And the engine wants you to lean it, right? They don't want to run rich. You know, about the lead plates out, the valves carbon up, spark plugs foul. The engine likes to be leaned. In our Skyhawk, we have a fuel flow meter. The owner had one put in. It's really dramatic. In normal cruise flight lean, the thing burns about 7.6 gallons an hour, 160 horsepower engine. Fly it around full rich, burns 9 gallons an hour. Okay, now your subject. How about keeping your plugs clean, and how about leaning on the ground? If you go to Cessna and pick up a brand new airplane, which I had the honor of doing several years ago, wasn't mine. Anyway, the factory teaches what they call a 2-finger lean. So that the Cessna instructor demonstrates to you that if you get the engine running and it's running smoothly and you ground lean it, you screw out the mixture control until it falters a little, screw it back in until it runs smoothly. And he says, okay, here's how you should run this thing while you're taxiing around. Then he points out that if you put 2 fingers in between the red knob and the aluminum stop, you know, it's almost always 2 fingers worth. So now if you know that, after you start the engine, you don't have to stand there and fiddle with it, screw it out, figure out where it falters, screw it back in. Just lean it 2 fingers. You got it. If you do that, the spark plugs won't foul. You ever look in the spark plugs, see those little balls of lead in there when the mechanic pulls them out? Tetraethyl lead plates out as metallic lead when the temperature of combustion is too low. If you keep the combustion temperature up and keep the mixture correct, and the combustion temperature up, by the way, is why you should run at 1,000 to 1,200 anytime the airplane's sitting still. Then your spark plugs don't foul. Your valves don't stick in the guides. Keeps maintenance costs down. So while we're at this subject, what happens if you get a bad mag check? You know, in spite of your best effort, whatever, you check the mags and the left one's really rough. Oh, crap. What do you do now? Okay, you can do what's called a burnout. And I see people will try to do this on check rides, but they haven't been taught properly. The right way to do a burnout, as I know it, is first, you have to go back to both mags, right? Because you want at least one spark plug in the offending cylinder to be firing it. If you were to leave it on the mag where you were getting the miss, now you're not getting anything firing in that plug. So no matter what you do, it's not going to get any better. So you have to go back to both magnetos, bring the power up to 2,000 RPM, lean the engine until it starts to falter, enrichen the mixture till it runs smoothly, and then sit there and wait 20 seconds. It's the longest 20 seconds of your life. It's like watching water boil or waiting for it to boil. Anyway, 20 seconds will generally do it. Go back to full rich, set the power back to run-up power, maybe 1,700 RPM, check the mags again. 9 times out of 10, your problem is gone because you raised the combustion temperature up high enough to burn all that crud off the offending spark plug, and now you're good to go. It's okay if it won't clear, you can try a full throttle burnout, doing the same thing, but do it at full throttle. You have to hold the brakes pretty firmly. If that won't do it for you, it's back to the shop, and they will have to pull the plugs. You do have to be sure that you go back to full rich for takeoff, though, right? Okay. How about a warm engine start? I see people, and I've seen checklists that say, and this is to start an engine that's, first of all, start an engine that's cold. Let's start there. Instead of using the throttle, instead of using the primer, I'll get the words right. Instead of using the primer, people will use the throttle like they're giving some extra gas in an old Ford pickup truck. You really can't do that. It's not safe, right? If you stroke the throttle, This gentleman just mouthed fire. He's got it. If you stroke the throttle, it is true that the accelerator pump will squirt fuel into the carburetor. But unlike an automobile, the carburetor is on the bottom, right? So the fuel squirts out, runs down into the carburetor air box, and then if you get a backfire during a start, not an uncommon thing, the engine makes that pop noise, it lights off the fuel in the carburetor air box because it fires back through the intake system, and you have an engine fire. So what I want to say next is, I'm not advocating doing that. If the engine truly needs to be primed, you need to use the primer, because the primer pump squirts the extra fuel either directly into the cylinders or into the intake manifold just outside the intake valve, but it doesn't run down in the carburetor air box. So what comes up, though, is if you've flown an airplane, the engine's warmed up. Now you land over here and you go into the airport restaurant, get a sandwich, come back out 45 minutes, an hour later, the engine's warmed up. And we're doing carbureted engines here now, not fuel injected. The engine's warmed up, but if you just simply crack the throttle and crank the starter, well, it sits there and grinds a while. And it might start later, but you're doing a lot of starter grinding. Wouldn't it be nice if it's starting 1 or 2 blades? So you can get it to do that. So it's 2 hands for beginners. You put one hand over on the key so you can turn to the start position, put the other hand on the throttle. Turn on the master, holler clear prop, get all ready. Turn the key to start and the propeller starts to rotate. As soon as the propeller moves, stroke the throttle once. Go briskly, all the way in, all the way out, back in 1/4 inch. And I'm talking about moving it much faster than you would move the throttle, say, for a takeoff. Engines don't like to have the throttle moved real fast, right, when they're running. But in this case, we're trying to exercise the accelerator pump. So if you stroke the throttle while the engine's turning over, what happens when the accelerator pump squirts those 2 little squirts of fuel, air is already moving. Internal combustion engines are big air pumps. So it's already moving when the fuel squirts, the air going by grabs the fuel, takes it into the cylinders exactly where you want it to be, and the thing fires off in 1 or 2 blades. It works every time. It's really neat for a warm start. But I want to emphasize again, don't stroke the throttle when the propeller is still, because a lot of the fuel will end up in the carburetor air box and you risk a fire. Talk about radio. And instruments. One of the first things people learn in instrument flight is before you take off IFR, you set your radios up to the first fix, whether it happens to be a waypoint in GPS or the first VOR. You set your radios up on the ground to the best of your ability. Then when you take off, you don't have to fiddle with them because you're really busy IFR. You know, this applies to VFR flight as well, and new students. When they're getting ready, teaching them navigation, getting ready for their first solo cross country, you have to teach them how to not get lost. Get them to set the radios up on the ground. And I often, if I ask an applicant, how come you didn't set the radios up? I get the answer, oh, well, you know, well, I don't want to set up on the ground because I can't receive the VOR from here. Well, that's true. You can't receive it unless it's on the field. But you know what? You can put the frequency in the radio and you can reach over here to the OBS and you can set it for the approximate heading. Then after you take off and the flag goes away and the needle operates and you can listen to the ident, you know, you just have to make a minor adjustment with the OBS to center the needle to go to the VOR. You're not twizzling it when you need to be doing other stuff. And you should do the same thing with GPS. It's simpler, right? You're going to put in direct to, or perhaps you're going to enter a flight plan with several waypoints, but whatever. Do it on the ground while the airplane is sitting still. You know, I'm thankful when I get to do presentations in the morning because I don't have to compete with the air show. Okay. So anyway, it reduces the students' workload. They can pay attention to what they're doing with the radios because sometimes radios aren't real intuitive. Neither are forklifts. Anyway, and the big thing is it eliminates errors. I see people set VORs up in the air and they confuse 300 degrees with 30 degrees. You ever seen that? Have somebody wants 3 something and they do it off 30 or the other way? Speaking of that, when you have one of your students set up a VOR, what course do they put into the Omni bearing selector? When I do check rides and the applicant's going to demonstrate VOR navigation, I actually, a lot of times, see them put in the magnetic heading, which they calculated. But you know what? Electronic signals that pass through the air are not affected by wind. So you have to specifically point out to your students that they need to set in the magnetic course, the true course, adjusted for variation, right? Because VORs are already skewed on the chart to accommodate variation. But if they then add wind correction angle to it, you know, they're not going to be on the radial that they want. And incidentally, sometimes depending on the order that you do the calculations from winds aloft, they never even have magnetic course. You can pass over magnetic course, right, without having that number. Think about it. But at any rate, it should be magnetic course. Whenever a navigational thing goes awry, students get disoriented, lost, they're not headed in the right direction. Probably 9 times out of 10, if they would simply look at the wet compass in level flight and reset the directional gyro, the problem goes away. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that. So I always teach that. How often should you tell students to set the DG with the wet compass? I say they should at least look at it about every 10 minutes. And the more you're maneuvering, or the crappier the DG is, the more often you have to set it. Just had to buy one for my champ. I had to set it like every 2 minutes. It was bad. Anyway, when instrument approaches don't work, I know we don't do ADF approaches anymore, right? Not much. But boy, do they get screwed up if you don't have the DG and the magnetic compass in agreement. So get them to get in the habit of doing the magnetic compass and directional gyro check. Rudders. When you're teaching students basic aircraft control, how do you describe to them when they should use the rudder? And I say that all too often, instructors tell students that you need rudder if the ball is out. Step on the ball. And while that's true, if the ball is out, you do need rudder. The problem is then that leads to the logical conclusion that you don't need rudder if the ball isn't out. Well, guess what, people? If the ball is out, you already screwed up. You needed rudder and you didn't use it, so now the ball is out. So when I teach rudder usage, I start with, you need rudder anytime you turn the control wheel, and you only need it when the control wheel is turned. So you turn the control wheel to set bank, you need rudder in that direction simultaneously. And I emphasize it like ad nauseum, at the same time, along with, not before or after, it's during. You need it when you turn the wheel, and you don't need it when you don't turn, when the wheel isn't displaced. Now, I know later on you're going to teach crosswind landings, you're going to teach slips, you're going to teach other stuff about rudders, but you got to start in the right place. And if you start by telling them they need rudder when the ball is out, they're waiting for the ball to go out. So they roll into a turn, ball goes out. If it's a Skyhawk, the airframe catches up and the ball goes back in, right? Actually, without them doing anything. Oh, I guess we don't need rudder. But in the meantime, the airplane's fishtailed and everybody in the airplane feels like they're falling over. So even Skyhawks need rudder. So please teach them about using it. My teaching trick, and I don't have a slide for this, but my teaching trick is I show them, I put my fist in between the control wheel and my knee, and I say, pretend my fist is like a wooden stick. Anytime you turn the wheel, it pushes on the stick, pushes on your knee, the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone and so forth, causes you to push on the rudder. If you have that mental image that there's a mechanical interconnect between the wheel, your leg, and the rudder pedal, they'll use it at the right time. I occasionally get students will use it to rudder to roll in, but they won't use it to roll out. And I beat them up about that. I tell them it's both ways. And if I get around to the point of I'm teaching takeoffs and landings, and we're doing a lot of circuits around the pattern, and they won't use the rudder rolling in and rolling out of the various pattern turns, I just stop teaching them. I take them out to the practice area and tell them, I'm not letting you solo this airplane until you use the rudder for every turn. And I mean it, I won't. But I get people to have 50, 60 hours come to me for check rides. I say, hey, would you please demonstrate a steep turn to the left? And they just crank the wheel. And I've failed a couple people for doing that. Read the ACS. Every maneuver, it says that you fly the maneuvers in a coordinated manner. FAA doesn't want people flying around flat-footed. Short field and soft field landings. Let's talk about them. What works, what doesn't work. In order to talk about landing in a precise point, you have to talk about aim point versus the touchdown point. The aim point, the point where you're aiming the airplane, coming down on final, the aim point is where the airplane would strike the ground if you didn't flare. Now, we all know you're going to flare. You're not going to fly it into the ground. But you got to aim somewhere when you're coming down on final. That's what the aim point is. The touchdown point, because you're going to flare, the airplane floats forward, right? After you pick the nose up to level flight, doesn't touch right there. It floats along until it dissipates extra speed, then sets down. How far is that? Typically about 150 feet. So wherever the student selects to say, well, I'm going to touch down right at the top of the numbers or on the 1,000-foot markers, and as a DPE, I accept any place where they say. But then they have to be able to do it, right? Not supposed to touch down short, not more than 200 feet past. Now, my eyes aren't so finely calibrated that I can, while the airplane's in motion, that I can tell the difference between 200 feet and 230 feet. I can't do that. But I sure as heck can tell the difference between 200 feet and 500 feet. So you have to teach your students to aim short of where they want to touch down. And the biggest error in this is they won't take the power off when they have it made. They can't stand to reduce the power short of where they said they were going to touch down. It's like the airplane will just stop flying or something. But you have to tell them that it won't, and let them do some and show them that that's what's necessary to make it work. If you're doing true short field work where you really don't have much runway, you have to aim before the landing surface. You want to land right at the beginning, you're going to aim out in the grass somewhere or out in the brush, and then come to level flight, let it float up over the surface and set down 10 or 20 feet in and have room to stop. Which is really hard to get students to do, by the way. They can't stand to aim short of the runway. But that's what it takes if the runway is short. How do you tell if you're high or low? So you pick an aim point. You say, okay, I'm gonna land at the top of the numbers, so my aim point will be right where the grass meets a pavement. Okay, that'll work. You have those half a dozen big wide white stripes, then you get these 75-foot numbers, and I'll touch down right after them. Perfect. If you aim right where the pavement starts, you float right up to the top of the numbers. It'll set there every time. But how do you make this work? Okay, you have to tell coming down final whether you're high or low. So you're on final, you're descending. The point where the airplane would strike the ground is the point on the ground looking through the windscreen that's not moving up or down in the windscreen. It's the point that's stationary, and that's where the airplane will hit the ground. So if your chosen point is ever gradually moving up in the windscreen as you're going down final, that means you're going to hit the ground short of the desired point, or you're aiming short of your desired aim point, and you need a little power. Same thing if it's moving down in the windscreen and it's threatening to get hidden by the nose, by the cowling, that means you're high and you need to take power off. So that's how you adjust aim point. And then, by the way, people will adjust power because they're too high, and I'll take some power off. Well, that gets the airplane to descend more steeply. You come back onto the desired glide path or approach path, but they won't add it back, and they go through it. So they go from too high to too low, and vice versa. So when people adjust power, after they regain the appropriate approach path, glide path, they need to set the power back where it was before, so they don't trade one undesirable condition for another. How about soft field approach speed? What approach speed do you use for that? Oh, it's not published in the POH. What works in most airplanes is whatever is the published short field approach speed, add 5 knots or 5 miles an hour, however you're calibrated. Use that for the soft field approach speed. That in conjunction with carrying 200 RPM above flight idle will get you a soft touchdown every time. It's important not to go up in speed any more than 5 knots and not carry any more than 200 RPM, because then the airplane doesn't want to land, and it eats up a lot of runway. And often soft fields are also a little short, right? So you maybe don't have a lot of runway to give up. But you can get a nice soft touchdown if you do that. You do have to remember, by the way, if you carry a couple hundred RPM extra into the flare and the touchdown, when the wheels touch, pull the power off so it stays on the ground. Don't need extra power once you're down. What else do I have to tell you about this? I guess that'll do it. Here's 8 more quick things to tell you. Where do you look when you're turning? How do you tell, especially in the pattern, that you've turned 90 degrees, because it's a real common error, especially when people turn from base to final, that they only turn like 70 degrees and they're actually headed away from the runway on base. If you get your students before they turn to turn their head and look down the wing, see what the wing is pointing at, pick a building, a tree, a hill, some distinguishable feature on the ground out there, then look back to the front using the rudder and the ailerons, set the bank, and then as the airplane comes around, when the point that they looked at comes into view, they can roll the wings level, and you know what? They turn 90 degrees. They don't have to stare at the directional gyro, and it works. Actually, turning on the final, you usually need to turning from downwind on the base, you normally need to turn more than 90 degrees, right? Because you're going to have a crosswind on base, and if you don't angle in toward the end of the runway, the airplane's going to get blown further away while you're on base leg. And I find that a lot. People just won't turn far enough when they turn from downwind on a base. Okay. Oh, and obviously you have to remind them to lead the rollout a little bit before they get to their visual point, because it's just like teaching turns to a heading on the directional gyro. They have to roll out, or they'll lead the rollout, or they'll turn too far. I get people, and they fly the airplane, they saw them just constantly turning the wheel. Their hands are almost a blur. And if I ask, why are you doing that? And they say, well, it's a little bumpy today. I'm just trying to keep everything straight and level, trying to do a good job with the airplane. And I say, would you mind if I flew for a moment? And they go, oh, no, they're relieved, right? They don't have to fly. The examiner will fly. So they go, sure, you can fly. I say, okay, I've got the controls. So I put my hand on the controls, and then I'm not moving it. So I say, is the airplane doing anything differently when I'm flying than when you're flying? They say, well, no, it's not. Then I let go of it and put my hand on my lap. I say, is the airplane doing anything differently now than when you were flying it? Oh, no, it isn't. I say, I don't know how you fly across country. After about 20 minutes of doing that, my wrist would be ready to fall off. I don't know what that's all about. And so you ought to try to get your students to not get in the habit of doing that. All you're doing is wearing out that plastic bushing where that tube goes through the panel. And it must be very unpleasant for them to have to do that, for hour after hour. So I think you should do that. You have to tell them, yeah, sure. If the airplane actually goes into a turn, actually starts to turn right, certainly you'll have to fix that. But this constant fast sawing doesn't get anything. It's no wonder people quit flying. How about slips? Nobody likes slips but tail dragger pilots. I fly in a rocket champ. I like slips. Nobody else does. And it's one of the required maneuvers, so I have to ask people to demonstrate a slip. God, do I get to see ugly slips. People are all over the sky trying to do a simple slip. So the easiest way to do a slip, first, determine which side of the airplane the crosswind is going to be on, right? On final approach. Drop that wing. Crosswind off the left, drop the left wing. Apply full opposite rudder, all of it. Push the rudder to the firewall and hold it there. Now all that's left to do is maintain runway alignment. If the airplane needs to go to the left, in my example, increase the bank a little. It'll turn left. If the airplane needs to go to the right, take some out. It'll go to the right. But don't release the rudder until you're finished with the slip. Otherwise, they put the rudder in, they don't like it because the airplane's cockeyed, so they release some. Then they go, I'm supposed to be slipping, I better put it back in. Oh crap, I don't like that. They let it back out, and the nose is going whoosh, whoosh, back and forth. Then the students upset about this because they don't like the nose going back and forth. They're just making it really, really hard to do a simple maneuver. And the way out of it is teach them to pin the rudder to the firewall and steer like a truck. And when they get close enough to the ground, they've gotten as low as they wish to be, release the rudder pressure, level the wings, land the airplane, leave some crosswind control in if necessary, and it's really easy, and they're not all over the sky. Buckling safety belts. Gee, that sounds pretty basic. People get in the airplane, first thing they want to do is move the seat forward. They sit down the seat, they move the seat forward. Then they shut the door. Then they have to buckle their safety belts. Safety belt's way back there. They can't reach it. And the seat's touching the door, so they can't get the safety belt past the door. Then they're just fumbling all over the place trying to get these safety belts buckled. And I see this with experienced pilots come for flight reviews. You'd think they'd learn after a while. Best thing to do when you get in an airplane is sit down in the seat, leave the door open so you have elbow room. Get the safety belts, fish them out from behind the seat, wherever it is, buckle them and leave them very loose, including attach the shoulder harness if you have them. Just leave them very loose. Then shut the door. Then move the seat into flight position. Then, finally, snug up the lap belt first, and then set the tension on your shoulder harnesses. If people do the shoulder harness first, because it's right there and they pull it down, they lift the lap belt up off their lap, right? Because the shoulder harness comes tight. Then if you have an accident, God forbid, your body goes scooting out under that loose lap belt. You know, in the airlines, when they say, buckle the safety belt low and tight across your thighs, you know, they mean that's for a reason, because you'll go shooting out from under the safety belt if you don't have it tight. So lap belt is important to do first. Shutting the door. You know, doors have door handles, but in many airplanes they're pretty flimsy. I've seen plenty of broken door handles in airplanes. So what should you do? In a Cessna, where the windows swing out, you just simply open a window and shut the door from there, like in the photo. In Pipers, you don't have that choice, but they do have a vent window, but you have to use the Piper door handle. But in any case, if you open a window first, or open the little vent window in a Warrior, then when the door comes shut, you're compressing the air inside the airplane. The air has some place to go, and you don't have to slam the door nearly as hard. Slamming the doors beats them up over time. So at any rate, open the window and hold on to the window frame, because that's way stronger than that flimsy plastic handle. Another thing you'll find out over time, guess what? Mechanics will not lubricate your door latches, your hinges, or your seat rollers. You say, well, geez, I took it in for annual. Why don't they do that stuff? Because it's not in the list of things that the manufacturer mandates for an annual inspection. An 100-hour inspection is the same as an annual, right? It's just who's doing it. So I won't do it on the 100-hour either. So you're going to have to do it yourself. So you get yourself a can of LPS2 spray, and you spray those little seat rollers so the seat moves back and forth nicely. You shoot not into the lock. The locks themselves should have lock lubricant. It's graphite. But the bar that comes out when you rotate the handle forward, just shoot a little LPS2 spray in there and do the door hinges. You know what? Everything on the airplane works better when you do that. But if you wait for your mechanic to do it, you're never going to be satisfied. Let's put it that way. Taxi with a control wheel back. But when we're teaching people to taxi, we teach them that they have to hold the control wheel to compensate for any surface wind, right? So we tell them, climb into a headwind, dive away from a tailwind. That works. But what about when there just simply isn't much wind? You don't have to worry about getting flipped over at 5 or 8 knots. I say taxi with the control wheel back to relieve the pressure on the nose strut. The nose strut has O-rings in it, backing rings, and after a while they wear out. If you let the pressure of the nose the full weight of the front of the airplane on the nose strut, taxi around, and it's bouncing up and down. Pretty soon the thing's in the shop because the fluid ran out and they're resealing the nose struts. It's about a $200 repair these days because it takes the mechanic hour and a half to do it. You have to buy a seal kit for 70 or 80 bucks, and before you know it, you have a couple $100 in it. If you pull the control wheel back, it relieves the pressure. And you say, well, what do you mean? You're only taxiing 5 or 10 miles an hour. What do you mean that's going to relieve the pressure? And I say to you, when you're taxiing around, try it. We have the control wheel all the way forward, taxi speed, pull it back. Those will actually come up. The elevator is a little bit effective on the ground, and it relieves that pressure. And while you're at it, teach your students to get a rag and wipe all that black crud off the chrome part of the nose strap. And then you don't have to have it sealed as often either, because that black crap has grit in it and it wrecks the O-rings. Leave the beacon on. You have to have the beacon on whenever the engine's running, right? Since 1996 or whenever they changed the rule, you can start the engine and stop the engine with the beacon on. They're not solid state. A transient surge won't hurt them. And you know what? If you forget to shut the master switch off when you get out of the airplane, there's that red light flashing at you, and either you'll see it, or more embarrassing, some other person will see it and point it out to you. But you know what? You're better off to have somebody say, excuse me, I think you left your master switch on, than to come back 3 hours later and find out the battery's dead and the thing won't start. So there's lots of good reasons to always leave the beacon on. Now, old school pilots, though, that haven't gotten with this, will sometimes shut the beacon off on rental airplanes, so you can't be sure the beacon will be on, but we never shut ours off at the flight school. We teach people not to do it. Last one. This is an instrument thing. When I learned to fly on instruments back in the 70s at what is now American Flyers, for some older people here, if you remember, ATE, Aviation Training Enterprises, had locations all over the country. I took my advanced training at Aviation Training Enterprises of New York, out on Long Island. They merged with American Flyers. But anyway, those instructors very specifically taught that if you're trying to do an intercept, like intercept a localizer, and ATC gives you a turn a little bit late, or you, the pilot, are a little bit late initiating a turn to do an intercept, it's okay to, quote, hurry the turn. Use a bank a little bit greater than standard rate. Skyhawk standard rate turns about 15 degrees a bank. Get you a standard rate turn. You know, it's very helpful to know that 25-degree bank to get the airplane to come around and do the intercept correctly. It just won't hurt a thing, and it works better. But when I do instrument check rides now, nobody ever does that. They'll fly right through a localizer because they're just tenaciously trying to turn at standard rate. Like an extra degree would be terrible, but it works. And so I say, if you're teaching instruments, let them know that a little extra bank to get the airplane to come around is a good thing. But we're not doing aerobatics on instruments here. Okay, so now, click. That's the end of the formal part of my presentation. When I do flight review,
Well, that was a great presentation by Larry. And fortunately, he's such a dynamic speaker. He doesn't need my help. Apparently, I didn't pay enough to the internet gods or whatever happened, but my mic wouldn't unmute earlier. So there weren't a lot of questions tonight. Larry did such a great job. I just want to remind everybody that Larry was one of our best and biggest contributors to Mentor Magazine. We really appreciate his participation in the PDC at Oshkosh. I think he answered during his conversation today just about all the questions that were relayed to me. So I don't think there's a whole lot I can add. I learned something every time. One thing that I didn't know, and I will add this, is I didn't know that a plane at idle wouldn't stall with the nose trimmed all the way up. Learned something new. So that's really great. So I would just want to thank you. Larry does have, excuse me, does have 26 tips, or 30 as he calls them, but they're really 26, that he has available. You can go to, you can send him an email. He'll be happy to share them with you. I really appreciate it. That was Fly the Easy Way with Larry Bothe, and I wish you were here tonight to thank in person. So to earn wings credit, you just need to click the button on the right side of the screen. It'll take you to the link for the mastery quiz, and pass that, and it adds to your wings credit and towards your flight review. And your input always helps NAFI provide better features and benefits. Remember, you complete that survey, you're in the running for a NAFI 50th anniversary shirt. So we really appreciate you being here tonight. So once again, thank you for being here. And if we could advance to the next slide. Just a reminder that these are archived and available on the NAFI site, on the NAFI website, and please share them with your students. And just want to say thank you again for being here tonight. As I said, Larry's got these tips available. Take a look at them, share them with your students. In the meantime, if you got eMentor today, I get to fly airplanes again. So I'm going to be off doing that a little later. And so with that, everybody be safe. Have a wonderful Easter holiday or whatever. And we'll see you next month. Thanks again. Good night.